And welcome to Stepping Stones Live from the Basis Project with Britain's Deadly Decade, Part 1, John Smith, Princess Diana, Jill Dando with Caroline Stevens. Take it away.
Welcome to a Stepping Stones to Awareness show. I'm Caroline Stevens, and today I've got John Brindley from Leicestershire here in our studios. So John is a journalist. He writes for the davidicke.com website, and he's going to give us a bit of background about his life and then talk about the deaths of John Smith, Jill Dando and Princess Diana. Welcome, John.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I am from the Midlands. I've mainly been a reporter on a local newspaper. I didn't go national or anything like that, but I worked on a local newspaper for more than 2 decades, in fact. I would describe myself as a bit of a natural maverick, which means I can, sort of have interesting views. But my worldviews were very much affected by about 6 or 7 years that I spent with a Christian church. So I got converted into a church. And I think that this was an evangelical type of church. I think at that particular point, I took on board a lot of things that they presented to me, and I became perhaps more a person who respected the authorities and governments and powers during that time than ever before. I mean, the Bible talks about submitting to authorities and authorities being, of God, etc. The reason I'm saying that and presenting that is that I've really changed a lot of my views over the last few years. And I have a very interesting sort of parallel story with David Icke, because during the time that I was in the Christian church, I was extremely negative towards him. I saw him as a new age type guy. And I was watching that famous day. There was a very particular day when he was on Wogan. Do you remember that?
No.
No, okay. Well, Wogan, as you know, was like the daily chat show, evening chat show. And David Icke went on it. And he was somebody I knew because he'd been a former BBC broadcaster and he was into sport. So I listened to him and stuff like that. He used to present Grandstand.
That's probably why I didn't follow him.
Exactly. Well, since then, he'd become a Green Party national spokesman, and he was he was very much going on to the spiritual side of things. And he appeared on the Wogan show, and he made a lot of comments. And what he didn't say was that he was the Son of God. That was the one bit that was reported, and everyone said David Icke said he was the Son of God. He didn't say that, but he was certainly talking in a very spiritual way, and he was presenting himself in maybe slightly outlandish fashion. And Terry Wogan very famously said when David Icke mentioned that the audience were laughing, saying that the audience are laughing at you, not with you, which sort of destroyed David Icke for quite a long time. Wogan was right in the sense that they were actually laughing at him, but he became like somebody who was reviled in society after that.
But Christians do believe they're the children of
the
Creator.
And funnily enough, that was really what he was saying. He was saying, we are all sons of God. We're all children of...
We are.
Yeah, so as time went on, I was presented with David Icke again in another form. When somebody I met said, I'm really interested in David Icke because... in fact, this lady I'm talking about, she lived on the same road as he was brought up on.
Wow.
And that wasn't the reason why she was interested, but she presented me with a book, a David Icke book, and said, would you be interested in reading this? And I got through about 30 pages and I came to reptilians, and I thought, oh no, this is just way beyond me. And that sort of set me back for quite a few years. Now, what happened to me was that through different personal circumstances, which really possibly not really relevant to this, I got to the point a few years ago where I had a lot more time to myself. I wasn't necessarily working full time. I was living on my own, and I got more time to sort of think about things and to research things. And I've always been interested in the truth. And one of the areas I went into, I decided to think, well, what that guy David Icke's talking about now, or even if he's talking about anything, And I started looking at some of the things he was saying, not just about reptilians and about, the governments and things like that, but the nature of reality, which I think is extremely important. And it started me on this journey, and this journey is like going on and on. And it's changed my worldview hugely.
Once you take the red pill, you can't go back.
Exactly, and one of the elements of that red pill is seeing that. Let's put it this way: as a journalist, you want to believe that you're presenting the truth. You're presenting what's really happening.
I think you ought to talk to some of your fellow journalists.
Exactly. Well, some people do it unknowingly, and some people do it knowingly. But the point is that the things that I've discovered over the last few years, I think to summarise it would say that a lot of things that are presented to us as being the truth and as being real and dependable and genuine are anything but. And one of those is Britain, in terms of, I still, obviously I'm British and I love Britain in many respects, but I've had to change my viewpoint on what we're like as an establishment, not as a society. I still believe in the British people as individuals, as being fantastic people in general. But the role of Britain in the world, I was always brought up with the idea that, there was the Second World War, but this was like something in the past. And, we were a peaceful nation, and we are generally on the side of right and trying to sort things out in the world and play a defensive role, if you like. And I've had to change my mind that we maybe have an agenda that I never previously thought of.
Yeah, to think that World War II is continuing.
Exactly.
Never ended.
I find it so hard when people talk about, war memorials and it's 100 years since the First World War. If that was the end of things and we'd moved on, I'd be only too delighted to mark it. But the fact that over the last few years and continuing today and every day, we are at war, and the world is so much on the edge of a catastrophic sort of conflict, means to me we haven't moved on. And so why are we sort of talking about that?
We've got spiritual battles ahead.
We do. And
so we're going to focus on John Smith first of all.
Well, what I'm going to present in this talk today, and this is the first part of it, is the fact that there was a number of incidents, high-profile deaths, that occurred roughly in a decade. And we were talking about 1994. Actually, it went into 2005. Only one of those is actually officially a murder, and that was Jill Dando, because she was shot on her doorstep, so nobody could deny that was a murder. The others are presented in different ways, but I would suggest that the evidence is that actually all five of them were. And by linking these things together, you see a pattern of behaviour that I think that we need to learn from. So yes, we can start with John Smith.
John Smith, because he's the first, chronologically.
Yeah, he is chronologically, and we're talking about John Smith.
Could you explain to perhaps some of our younger viewers who was John Smith?
Who was John Smith?
Because there's lots of John Smiths.
There are, and some of them are even called that properly in real life.
I've even interviewed a John Smith. Yes.
Yeah,
so
that's right. I've got a good friend.
Beer.
I've got a very good friend called John Smith as well. But this John Smith was a Labour Party leader. Now, Labour Party leaders might be to a penny, but I think he was a very significant one, although he never became Prime Minister. He could well have become Prime Minister if things had taken a different view, a different way. The background to it was he was a Labour politician. He'd actually played a ministerial role in Harold Wilson's government, and then Jim Callaghan. We're talking about the 1970s. And then obviously Labour ran into all sorts of difficulties, and Mrs. Thatcher took over in 1979, yeah?
Right.
And she sort of led the Conservatives in government through to the time when she was deposed in 1990. During all that time, John Smith was a member of the Shadow Cabinet in different roles. So he was keeping his nose clean and doing well, progressing in the Labour Party and well regarded.
So did he come from the shop floor, John Smith?
Yeah, exactly. He came from the shop. He came to the shop. He was what I would call a usual type of socialist gentleman. You know, not maybe as left wing as some of the Labour people today, but a socialist and somebody who's a social reformer, I would say. And his final role during the final years of Mrs Thatcher, and then when John Major took over, was as Shadow Chancellor. So he was well up there. Now, if you remember, because you're too young to remember, but 1992 was the election that Labour felt as though they were very strongly they were going to win. I mean, they'd lost the previous 3 elections. It was
time for them to
exactly
back into the game.
And this was the year or the election where Neil Kinnock, he was almost celebrating victory, wasn't he, at their party conference? And then I think wasn't there a headline saying that the last person out to turn off the lights, something like that, and yet he lost. John Major managed to turn things around from the point where Mrs Thatcher was deposed by the coup that was led by Michael Heseltine, and actually win the 1992 election. Now, I saw some material where at this particular point Tony Blair was sort of making progress within the Labour Party. He was one of those who said, we should stick behind our leader and all this type of stuff.
This is the Tony Blair at that time who was very against the EEC.
Yes,
EU.
Exactly. Things do change sometimes, don't they?
People can be so fickle.
They can be so fickle. So yeah, he was supportive of Neil Kinnock at that point, but Neil Kinnock did fall on his sword, almost inevitably, because he'd lost 2 general elections. So how many general elections can a party leader lose? So the obvious candidate to take over the Labour Party was John Smith, and that was what happened. And actually, he did a very, very good job, because from the defeat in 1992 to the point where he died in 1994, which is just 2 years, he led the Labour Party to a 23% lead in the polls. Now you have to be
23% of 23 points.
Oh, you're so political. 23 points. 23 points, if you like. Yeah. So they were well ahead, and he'd had some. He was quite successful in a number of issues during that time, and he was basically. He was leading the agenda in many respects, and saying and.
Did he support the EU?
Generally, yes. Yes, he generally did. He generally did support the EU. I like to present also an interesting thing about John Smith, that he was invited to Bilderberg, which was just after he'd been elected. And
because Margaret Thatcher went to a Bilderberg conference, didn't she?
Yeah, I think most of them have been there at some point, haven't they? Now you could say this as a very naive thing about John Smith, but apparently he presented a paper on socio-economic reform to Bilderberg, and he was saying, I don't believe in the way that you are talking about economic affairs. Now that is extremely naive, because you don't argue with the establishment. Yeah, exactly. He even suggested that he should come back again, and he would come with another representative, and he would further the points that he was making. Well, guess what? He was never invited back. That's a surprise, isn't it? But do you know who was there the following year?
Tony Blair?
Oh, Tony Blair. Yes, exactly. Tony Blair was there in 1993, and in 1994... there was no longer any John Smith.
By the way, you can be a Bilderberger but not actually go to the meetings, and I think there's a bit of a... people don't perhaps realise that. So when I've said, so-and-so is a Bilderberger, I said, no, can't be, they've never attended... No, but you don't necessarily advertise yourself, do you?
No, exactly. I mean, it is very cloak and dagger anyway, isn't it? I mean, some people go there and they might just be there for a particular occasion. They're called in for that particular year because there's something about them, or there's something about the issues that they're going to bring up or whatever. There are others, like Ken Clarke, I just brought him in.
Well, I mean, he's mentioned in Parliament by Philip Davis MP.
Yeah, exactly. And he goes there every year. And he was actually, it was a rather amusing clip, wasn't it? Where he was questioned about why is it that all these sort of world leaders get together.
This was Philip, wasn't it? Mentioned
in
Parliament.
And there's no particular agenda. And funnily enough, there's no real minutes either.
And then Ken Clark responds and says, Are you feeling left out? Did you want to go?
And he also says something on the lines of, that it's such a great opportunity for people to get together from different countries and network without the press being there and without an agenda. And I'm thinking, do you know what? It would be very, very difficult to persuade all those people to give up their time, wouldn't it? Unless there was something really in it for them.
Have they heard of Skype?
Exactly. So it's, it wasn't real. But the interesting point about John Smith was, and we have to mention this because of the circumstances in which he died, is that there was an issue about his health, right, which Tony Blair himself made a big point of.
Yeah.
Now, what is true is that he did have a heart attack in October 1988. Now, he was known at that particular point as being a drinker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He had this heart attack, and he responded to that by changing his lifestyle considerably. So, for instance, he went on a 1,000 calorie a day diet, which is pretty strict, isn't it?
It is pretty
sensible.
strict.
He quit smoking. He reduced his drinking, and he took up something I wouldn't recommend particularly called Monroe bagging.
What's that?
Good question. He climbed a total of 108 of the 277 Scottish Munro Mountains. Now, overall, I would say it sounds as though he was a pretty fit guy to me.
Mm.
Exactly.
Turned his life around.
Yeah. He also lost nearly 3 stones in weight. So he came back revitalised, basically. And he was, he'd become leader of the Labour Party, and his life was moving on. So to suggest that he was a very fragile man who was living a lifestyle that, sort of, you could then say it wasn't surprising what happened to him isn't really true at all.
No.
But we do have an interesting thing here, because Tony Blair not only sort of spoke quite a bit about John Smith's health, but actually speculated about it in a very direct way. Shall I read to you the exact words?
Yes,
These are his words. They're not. They're definite. He says this was in his memoirs, actually, called A Journey, and the conversation is, or the quote that he's given is supposedly a conversation he had with his wife Cherie, right? And
who reported on this?
This is him writing on this. So he says here, if John dies, I will be leader, not Gordon. And obviously we're talking about Gordon Brown there. I will explain the significance of that in a second. And somehow I think this will happen. I just think it will. And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm trying to be as honest as possible here, that yes, there'll be lots of people who will have been in a position in an office or in an organisation, and they will think to themselves, well, what would happen if like so and so left? Would I be the person to take over? And that's like human nature in a sense, isn't it? But to speculate to this degree and to put it in your memoirs, I don't think is quite. It doesn't sit very well with me, certainly.
No.
And then when he says here, if John dies, I will be leader, he seems to me to be suggesting that it's quite a possibility that he would die fairly quickly. Because, if he's saying, well, I think he might die in 10, 15 years' time, Tony Blair may never have even been in the cabinet or anything, He was speculating on this particular, the circumstances as they were at that point. And what they were at that point was that Gordon Brown was significantly ahead of Tony Blair in the pecking order. Yeah? Because we had the situation where after John Smith's death, there was this famous meeting between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and whatever the agreement that was made, the agreement was made that Tony Blair was going to stand as the leader and Gordon Brown was not. And maybe very much, I think possibly, that an agreement was made that at some point the transfer of power would come, which did in fact come, didn't it, much later, when the New Labour were in a lot of trouble. But I think you'd agree that that level of speculation about...
Very suspicious, isn't it?
It certainly does not sit very well with me.
No.
But a lot of these things, when they happen at the... certainly when John Smith's death occurred at the time, I had no idea of the significance of it. And you only have really an idea of the significance of this particular incident when you see what happens in politics in the years to come. The rise of New Labour, the Iraq War, the significance of Tony Blair's premiership. You say we're not as ordinary people privy to be able to look down the line and see what's going to happen. However, I believe that elite people very often are, and they're not taken by surprise.
We can't look behind the curtain. We don't know we don't know about those meetings that they hold. And of course, people think, we talk about the personalities in Parliament today, don't we?
Yeah.
As if everything is above board.
Yeah.
And even when Theresa May was appointed,
yeah.
it was all done behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Remain's sponsor played a big part, no doubt,
yeah.
and it was the Tory grandees who chose.
I mean, it's always made me laugh. Well, it has in the last few years made me laugh when people talk about democracy, because we talk about America being the land of the free and et cetera, and protect our democracy. The more you go into things, the more you realise that the democracy is extremely fragile.
Absolutely.
I mean, yes, we hold elections, and yes, you have a vote and I have a vote and everyone has a vote, but I believe that certain candidates are pushed our way and certain candidates are pushed aside.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, I've stood for Parliament, and you have to pass a test. You
Did you pass?
Have to be approved. Yes, finally. But you have to go through an assessment.
Yeah. And
what's to say that they're not assessing you on whether you are going to toe the line or not?
Exactly.
I mean, there aren't that many mavericks in Parliament.
No.
I mean, I can think of Philip Davis.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of Dennis Skinner.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't, the Beast of Bolsover.
Yeah,
Dennis Skinner, but I can't think of many other mavericks in Parliament.
Exactly. No, I mean, in Parliament, if you should decide to go against the party line on a issue that is regarded as being sacrosanct, then really that's your career finished. I mean, you might have your 5 minutes of fame, but your chance, you will not be a minister. You will lose, and you hear the stories, don't you, where people have spoken out and said, I was told.
Yeah.
You've got to come straight on this particular one, otherwise you're going to find things aren't going to fall for you in the future. It's like it's basically blackmail, isn't it?
Well, the whip system is about blackmail.
Oh, totally. Yeah, totally.
So I mean, the information is kept in the filing cabinet until such time as it's convenient to release the information accidentally to the media.
Did you see the piece about the black book? It was actually
Tim Fortescue.
Yeah. It was a famous piece of broadcasting, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Where he basically admitted that the Conservative Party had a black book of the misdemeanours, and when they was questioned about what these misdemeanours were, he actually mentioned boys, didn't they? He mentioned
paedophilia.
That's what he was talking about. And the idea was, if you fail to toe the line, then we will suddenly open this book and you will find that an allegation might be made against you or something like that. I mean, people sort of will hear something like that, and then they'll presume, oh well, that was the 70s or something like that. Of course, it doesn't occur now.
We've had a recent case, haven't we? The MP in the north who has been quoted as being with rent boys and cocaine.
Right.
and what's happened to him?
Yeah.
The investigation's been dropped.
Yeah.
These allegations.
Yeah. It's. I mean, what we're talking about really is quite a dirty business and a cutthroat business, and I think a lot of people now accept that is the case. It is a cutthroat business, and it was a cutthroat business for John Smith. I mean,
Ben, people trusted politicians far more, as you say,
Well,
than
they
they
did.
do today, and now many people think, if they're moving their mouths, they must be.
yes, maybe not telling entirely the whole truth
Yes,
and nothing but the
exactly.
truth. I mean, John's going back to John Smith. I mean, the very night before he died, he was speaking at a fundraising dinner at the Park Lane Hotel in London.
What were they do you know what they were fundraising for?
No.
No.
I don't know what they were fundraising for, but.
And what did he say?
Yeah, well, his message was very simple. He says, "The opportunity to serve our country, that's all we ask," and that really summed it up. He was in such a good position to win the next election. Now, just imagine what would have happened or what would not have happened had that have occurred. If John Smith had remained in office and won the 1997 general election, as I said, he was 23 points ahead. It's like being 4-0 up at half time, and you can't really lose. Then there would have been no Tony Blair as Prime Minister of this country, because it was very, very possible that he might have even made a good job of it. That's an extraordinary view, isn't it? He could have been a fairly popular Prime Minister and maybe stuck around a bit longer.
But the establishment weren't going to be happy with that, would they?
They were not happy. So when we were talking here about a precise window where if the establishment's person was put in power within the Labour Party, he was in a very good position to become the next Prime Minister of this country and take the country in a completely different direction. In my opinion, I think that probably Kinnock was the founder of New Labour and had started to reform. John Smith was slowing it down. He was in favour of moving Labour. He realised that they'd sort of they couldn't stick in the past and the problems they'd had in the 70s and etc., where they become unelectable. But he was doing it step by step, which is much more sensible. That wasn't enough for the establishment. The establishment wanted someone to come in and move it on and really do something
radical.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it now, would you not agree that what happened was a formation of a completely different party? New Labour was as different from the Labour Party of the 70s as it's possible to be. I mean, but for the word Labour, was there any similarity between the two things?
Was there much difference between New Labour and the Tory Party now?
Well, yes, exactly.
You can't put a cigarette paper between.
Yeah, and the people that I felt sorry for at the time were those socialists who sort of waited for a long, long time for power, and they believed in Blair. I mean, I think that a lot of the natural human nature is to believe the best and think, oh, here's the guy. We had
some saviour.
Yeah, we had the likes of Michael Foot, and we had the likes of John. Well, we had Neil Kinnock, but primarily, who had failed to deliver power, and here was this clean cut, fast talking, fairly youthful guy who we knew very little about for the negative. We'd seen him appear on TV and come across particularly well.
He was a slick performer, wasn't he?
Exactly. Who could, and he was the obvious candidate from that point of view. And I think the interesting thing was that the media, the newspapers are quite often sort of linked as being fairly sort of supportive of the Conservative Party. Murdoch's media went straight behind Labour when Tony Blair took over. He was the man for them, and it all happened because of the death of John Smith. Yeah, shall I tell you some of the things that the newspapers said when John Smith died? we're quoting the Sun here. We'll forgive ourselves for just quoting it once, won't we? Their front page headline was Britain's next Prime Minister died yesterday. So they were pretty convinced, weren't they, that John Smith was going to become Prime Minister. The Independent, their version was the man who would have led Britain, saying exactly the same thing. It was such a big incident that apparently the 9 o'clock news was extended for an hour, to the hour mark, more than half an hour. And interestingly, the edition of Casualty was cancelled, and that was called Cardiac Arrest. Bit of an irony there, isn't there?
Very. So that's one death.
Well, we'll say that that as far as the establishment is concerned and the official story was concerned, John Smith subsequently died of a heart attack, and the day after that fundraising dinner, he was taken ill at his Barbican flat. He was ill. He was dead within an hour. We know subsequently that it is possible for illnesses like that, a heart attack or even cancer, to be inflicted on people in a different way. Now, that might some people might find that a difficult concept to manage, but it is, I believe strongly it's true that people can have that such things can be brought on from outside. We'll never know for 100% certain. We cannot prove it. I can't prove it here, can I? But what I do know is that the circumstances were so convenient for a certain person to take charge, to leapfrog above the person who also should have had the job, which is Gordon Brown, and take office. And a lot of the rest is history. And John, he was just the latest, really, in a succession of what you would call socialist leaders or prime ministers that were handled in a not the best way. I mean, Harold Wilson apparently was bugged, burgled, blasted out of office by MI5 in the 70s. There was the death of Hugh Gateskill, his predecessor as Labour Party leader, poisoned. Officially no malpractice as far as we were told, but certainly a death that people have talked about since. So it appears that people who want to take Britain down a particular route are not welcomed, and John Smith may well have been one of those.
So now we move on to the royal family and the Queen of Hearts.
And you know what? That is such a great. That's such a great phrase as well, which I totally relate to, because
she gave the royal family a real human touch, didn't she?
Absolutely. I mean, do you remember very well the week between her death and the funeral?
I wasn't in the country at the time. I was in the Australian outback, but I remember being told. One of the guys in the bus said, "Your princess has just died." Yeah. And it's one of those situations where everybody knew where they were when the announcement was made. I can certainly relate to that, and the shock. I mean, just comparing it. I do remember where I was when I heard about the Queen Mother dying, but I almost shrugged that off. And I was thinking, I've just heard on radio the Queen Mother's died. But how did Forrest get on today? Oh, they lost. Oh, it's just a normal Saturday, It didn't hit me. I can't even remember her funeral or what happened after that occasion. I'm coming from a slightly non-royalist point of view, but when Diana died, in contrast, it was the most amazing week of mourning. Yeah. I would say repentance. I felt that I felt as though it was a sacred time, and I use that word advisedly, really. And obviously, partly it must have been because of the energies of all of so many people feeling the same thing. Well, people who weren't even royalists.
Exactly.
They identified
Yeah, exactly.
with Diana.
And people have never met her or are likely to meet her, like myself. I knew that I liked her and respected her enormously, but I was taken aback by how much I thought about it and how, utterly gutted and upset I was. And I think a lot of people said the same thing.
Yeah.
It's like it was like a death in the family and worse.
Of course.
And we've really seriously got to ask ourselves a question as to why we would think like that. And if we look at Diana,
Yeah.
She is now really being airbrushed from history, in my
Yeah.
opinion, and that is why I think it's important that we're doing this today and talking about her.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people who obviously they weren't even alive when Diana was alive. It's now 20 years, isn't it? 21 years since she died, and we're very good in this country, and maybe we're not the only country that does this, in sort of believe in retaining the bits that suit our agenda and emphasising them and perhaps neglecting a few other things. So people will say, oh yes, well Diana, she had her faults, didn't she? She was she had a lot of boyfriends and she was sort of playing around, and it was a bit she wasn't quite what you'd expect from an establishment figure. Well, I'm putting all that aside and going into the context of her life, which was that, we first encountered her as a teenager who obviously was brought up in a very aristocratic family, but was suddenly thrust into this amazing fairy tale, as we saw it, of a marriage to Prince Charles, the heir to the throne. And now when we look back on it, we can see the holes, can't we? Because we can see, it isn't always the case that someone of she was just about 19 or 20 at the time. I think she was 20 by the time she got married. That marries someone sort of 15, 16 years older, of completely different experience, and she was a very sort of naive girl, and that was why she was chosen. She was chosen, in my opinion,
her innocence.
I mean, Charles had a lot of girlfriends, basically. He was a bachelor man, but there'd been some problems and with some of his selections, and the main person I'm speaking about is Camilla. Yeah, Camilla Parker Bowles. He'd had a relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Fair enough. However, and in this particular part, you feel a little bit sorry for the guy, because in a normal situation, two people fall in love, it's their decision whether they pursue that relationship or decide to move on. Charles was whatever his thinking at that particular point, was not allowed to make his own decision.
We got the story.
Yeah.
I understood that he returned from a military career and Camilla hadn't waited for him.
I think more likely the fact was that the decision had been made that the important thing to think about was heirs. He needed to produce children. Camilla had already had a boyfriend, and she was therefore not a virgin, and their purity of bloodlines is something that is important to them.
Yeah.
They demand that. They did that certainly for heirs of the throne anyway. There's also a point about her Catholic links as well. Camilla's Catholic links. You don't have a Catholic queen, do you?
No.
So they, the phrase, the phrase of the broodmare,
Mm-hmm.
and Diana was obviously chosen as the person to have children with Charles. Not only was she not first choice in terms of love, she wasn't even the first choice in the family. I mean, he went out with her sister, Sarah, for a short while. But you can't blame Diana as an
No.
impressionable young woman being confronted with this remarkable opportunity that she took it. You know, people say, "Oh, she should have known." You know, please. You know,
How many times did they meet? About 12 times before.
Yeah,
I mean,
not
you
many.
become trapped, don't you?
Yeah, yeah.
And the world
Yeah.
is looking at you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was a famous quote, wasn't there, about my name's on the tea towel, or my image is on the tea towel. She certainly had some doubts before the marriage.
And then after that, she was interviewed and she said, "There's 3 of us in this marriage."
Well, exactly. And I think the point that needs to be made, because this is where the airbrushing comes in, or part of the airbrushing, is that, you know, whereas people would like to think that from a Charles point of view and from a royal family point of
Yeah.
view, that the relationship between Charles and Camilla was laid aside, and then, you know, once
Resurrected.
and then only when his relationship, his marriage with Diana had broken down irretrievably, did he then sort of, you know, rejoin with Camilla. There is really no evidence for that. There is no evidence that the relationship with Camilla was put aside. I mean, first of all, unbelievably, Camilla was very much part of the vetting process to provide the bride for Charles. So out of those 12 meetings, she was present on several of those occasions, which, you know, you think, hang on a minute, I'm going out with this bloke and there's his ex-girlfriend and they seem very, very close. That's not it's not a normal courting procedure, is it?
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that. But, you know...
I mean, didn't Diana come across a present for her birthday?
Yeah.
Because her and Camilla,
Yeah.
they have their birthdays very, very close together,
Yeah.
if not even on the same day.
Yeah.
And she thought it was her present for her.
Yeah.
And
there was
it was for Camilla.
There was the cufflinks, wasn't there, on the honeymoon as well, with the C written on it. And I mean, I think the evidence is much more that yes, she went into the background a little bit, and maybe she did go into the background a little bit because Diana was, you know, suspicious. But the relationship between Charles and Camilla was never dead. That was always a living, you know, relationship, whereas the marriage between Prince Charles and Diana was mostly to have children, and it was not to be viewed as something that was permanent. I know when people watch that show on television, it was permanent, wasn't it? It's a fairy tale. It's like the princess and the prince go off and live happily ever after. It was never, in royal family, their agenda, that wasn't the case.
No.
It wasn't the case. And, you know...
She must have felt so isolated.
Absolutely. She felt so isolated. She had a situation where she didn't know who to trust, because she had people. In the end, the household even broke off. She had her own staff. Charles had his staff. You know, when there were the tapes, weren't they? The conflicting tapes. There was tapes of her with, perhaps it was James Hewitt, I think.
Yeah.
And there was tapes of Charles and Camilla, and therefore you got people in the background cooperating, making those type of things available. So some people seeming to be on Diana's side, some people seeming to be on Charles's side. It had become like that, sort of like two sides rather than one side. And you know, can she trust her staff? Are they really actually working for Charles?
Yeah.
She must have and she did. She became very paranoid, and she sought advice from a lot of people. And because she did have a spiritual element to her, one of the sort of things that happened to her was that she sought advice from a lot of mediums, astrologers, psychics, and wanting to know, you know,
what's going to happen, I guess.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And that, I think, played a part in unsettling her and making her even... there was an element of instability there within her.
Well, you would if there was 3 of you in the marriage from the start.
Well, exactly, because some of her paranoia was based on truth. She was right in what she was thinking. I mean, when she one time she confronted Charles about it, and his reply was, "Well, I won't be the only heir to the throne that has never had a mistress." So he basically admitted it to her, really, and she. With the psychics, she was getting a lot of conflicting advice, because you would do. This would have made life hard for her.
Yeah.
Now there was a psychic who I knew quite well, and I only knew this story some years afterwards when I spoke to her on the phone, and she said to me, I was one of the psychics who counselled Diana, and this lady is a very honest lady. And she didn't at all make any protestation and say, "Oh, I was her main guide" or anything like that. She told me, Diana was seeking advice from lots and lots of different people, but this was prior to the relationship with Dodie. Yeah, and that's quite important. Diana gave this lady, and I'm not going to give her name, a note. And it's a version of the same note that sort of was the famous one, really, which was, in the event of me dying in a car accident, it will have been organised by my husband. Now, there was a version of that, wasn't there, for Burrell? Burrell had one. And there's different versions, but basically the same message was coming out time and time again. And I said to her, so what were you supposed to do with this information? So she said, Diana told me that if she did pass away, to pass this on to my local police station. So she did, and of course nothing happened. We all know that. It's almost fruitless in some respects to speculate on exactly the reasons why Diana was taken out. We could argue about the landmines. We could argue about. Some people will bring up the Dodie relationship and say, she may have been pregnant, she may have married Dodie. The difficulties of a change of lifestyle for her. I think in some respects all of them are a bit of a red herring.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that, say, remember the note that I was just talking about was done before the Dodie relationship. She had long since known that she was in trouble and that she was being bugged, and that that her life might be in danger. In some respects, it was always going to be the case. I think she may have surprised some people by how strong she was in terms of wanting to communicate.
Yeah.
And I mean, the book with Andrew Merton must have been a huge shock to the establishment.
Is it Morton?
Andrew Morton,
That's right.
yes. Yeah, I was thinking of Mrs. Merton there. Sorry, I just got
That was there was an interview on the TV as well, wasn't there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing about the book was that he never actually went through the gates of the palace to talk to her. He was interviewed about this. It was quite interesting. He says because he was known as a royal correspondent, he would have been turned away at the gates, basically. And they would have thought it was very suspicious if somebody like him as a writer was going into the palace and talking to Diana. So he sent somebody else in with a tape machine. Very old-fashioned, wasn't it? And he set the questions, and this guy asked the questions to Diana.
Right.
And then the tapes came back to the author, and he was actually gobsmacked. He knew he'd graduated from being a sort of sycophantic royal correspondent to having there's something wrong here. Yeah. Otherwise he wouldn't have been doing the book. But he was actually very surprised at how the revelations that were coming through, and the depth of the despair of Diana, and the depth of the bad relationship that she'd had with Charles, and the problems she was having with it and had with the rest of the royal family. So he was actually surprised. But that book, I mean, I don't know if you read that book, but that was a major revelation at the time. And then, as you say, 1995 came the Panorama interview with Martin Bashir,
Yeah.
which was a real watershed moment. I remember watching that, and although we knew, I think before the broadcast was made, that there were 3 in the marriage, for her to actually say it, and for us to be able to, sort of take on board how she was feeling about it, because she communicated it very, very well, and for her to say, to talk about the fact that she felt as though she would never be queen. But then to talk and bring up the issue that you started at the beginning with, the Queen of Hearts. It was an astonishing interview in many respects. But how do you think that would have gone down, in the corridors of power? Here's someone,
She was taking all the limelight, wasn't she? I mean, it's obvious that Prince Charles didn't like that.
Yeah, he found it very, very difficult during the time when they were really together. I can understand it from one point of view. When Charles and Diana were going on walkabouts, the press are only interested in Diana, and you can understand his despair from his point of view, that basically all they're looking for is good images, and Diana is the better image. I think we can say.
Yeah.
And and the way he sees things is, I'm the heir to the throne here. I'm the man with gravitas, and she's my, she's the the mother of my children. That's all. And yet the media are sort of, only interested in her. So she'd always taken the limelight, and it had always gone down extremely badly. And here she was threatening. She's now going to, she will probably be removed from the royal family. The relationship had gone, etc., etc. I think at the time of Panorama, I don't think they were quite divorced, were they? But I think it was the message went out afterwards that they needed to divorce. The Queen sent that out fairly soon afterwards. But it was pretty obvious, wasn't it, that whatever happened, even if they remove her from the royal family altogether, she was not going to go quietly.
You could see it building up over a series of weeks and months, events following the media, the way they followed Diana, and they kept on trying to be negative towards her as well, and who she was with, and being on aboard the yachts, and so on. And so it seems almost inevitable about her being almost put out of her misery. And out of the royal family's hair. Because she must have been a thorn in their side. Yeah,
she was very much a thorn in their side. If we turn to her death, which is obviously most,
in France, in Paris, after a night out.
Yeah, where they had the worst record in Europe for investigating car accidents, apparently. Just a coincidence, of course. I bet most people would probably think, the inquest. We remember there was an inquest held.
Yeah, there was.
And I bet the majority of people probably think, of course it was. They said she died in an accident. It died as a result of an accident. That's possible.
Right.
In fact, the verdict was unlawful killing. Obviously, the accident being part of that, but unlawful killing was actually the verdict. Interestingly, she did not die totally as a result of that accident. She walked out of that car. I mean, it took a long time for them to get there, by the way. Something like 37 minutes from the car smashing into the 13th pillar.
Yeah.
By the way, 13th pillar of the Pont d'Alma Hotel, which means the passage of the moon goddess, who's Diana, of course. There's a lot of symbolism in all this. David Icke goes into it in greater detail than I can do. But 37 minutes later, she's out of the car. A firefighter, Xavier Gourmelon, who treated her at the scene. These are his words, right? To be honest, I thought she would live. As far as I knew, when she was in the ambulance, she was alive, and I expected her to live. I found out later she had died in hospital. It was very upsetting. I mean, there were comments that she emerged from she was taken out of the car, and she had an injury to her shoulder.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to look with suspicion both at the circumstances of the accident and what happened in the tunnel afterwards. Circumstances of the accident, you've got all sorts of sort of problems there. One is the fact that the story about Henri Paul was so inaccurate that if he really was an alcoholic, do you think he would have passed his pilot's license a few weeks before? Do you think somebody as prominent as Mohammed El Fayed would have employed him as a dependable?
Yes.
He just happened to be a product, an agent for both British and French secret intelligence, by the way, as well. He was a moderate drinker. There was another death that day in the same area, so there's a possibility that the sample that they attributed to him wasn't the right one.
Could have been switched.
Exactly. There's the problem that none of the security lights between the Ritz Hotel, where they set off from after her night out, and the tunnel were working. The fact that the box, there was a box, usually in such a Mercedes that they drove, there was a box. The box would have given, like a box as in an aircraft, would have given the full story of that journey.
That box.
And it wasn't there. It'd been taken out because apparently there'd been an accident. The car had been damaged and the box had been taken out. Amazing, isn't it? It's shrouded in mystery, the whole thing, and but you would know, would you not, that when it came to reporting the inquest, that the journalists involved would have been thinking, all these conspiracy theories are such nonsense. You've got to laugh in retrospect, but in the circumstances where, like, somebody who was formerly a member of the royal family died, the inquest is held in the Queen's Court, the Courts of Justice in London. You've got, the judge who swears allegiance to the Queen in charge of the inquiry.
Yeah.
You've got the fact that there's no royal people. They decided that no representatives of the royal family need to be called as witnesses. All these things, we were never through official means ever going to get to the truth. I'll say one other thing about the inquest, which is interesting, because it sort of like puts a different spin on something that a lot of people, and I certainly thought at the time. It was reported that that she died. She died. The car had gone into the tunnel. That there'd been a contributory factor to whatever mistakes that the driver made were the presence of people following the car.
Yeah, it was the
on
paparazzi,
motorbikes.
wasn't it? Supposedly.
Exactly. But the interesting point was that apparently deeper research showed that, yes, the paparazzi would be outside of the Ritz Hotel. Yes, they followed her on bikes, but they were all accounted for further away than outside the tunnel. In other words, this, the big car, the Mercedes car, had basically gone ahead of them. They were left behind. So these people, the people immediately outside the tunnel, we're left to, who were they? Who was, what about the Fiat Uno?
So who was in the car ahead of them? Do we know?
I don't know about the car ahead of them, but I suspect that the people on the motorbikes were not paparazzi, and they were contributory to what happened. Which is extremely worrying, isn't it? And it's not only the death of Diana, but deaths of people around her as well that should be looked at with suspicion. I mean, in Diana's search for love, apparently the first person she was linked with was her bodyguard, a man called Barry Manicky. And this is something that made the press abroad, but of course they didn't make the press in England, surprisingly enough. That these two were having a relationship, and she was again looking for someone to depend upon, and apparently thought a great deal of him as well. Now he died in a traffic accident as well. Unexplained accident. which was delightfully, apparently, explained to her by Charles as they were about to attend a very important event. So a public event, they got all the cameras on Diana, and Charles says something like, "Oh, shame what happened to Barry Manicky, isn't it?" And that's how she finds out that he's died. She then starts joining the dots, because she had a subsequent phone call from, maybe quite a long time afterwards, actually, years later, from James Hewitt, who she obviously was, she admitted to having a relationship with James Hewitt, a long one and a deep one. And James Hewitt said, "I've been warned off by the establishment. I've been warned off you that they are not, people do not like this relationship. And if it continues, you may go the same way as Barry Manicky." So she then sort of, the dots are joined. Mm-hmm. Barry Manicky was in an accident that wasn't really an accident. So do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And then we've also, another one that people don't talk about very much is Sarah Ferguson's mother, Susan Barantes.
From Argentina?
Yeah, exactly. Well, she lived in Argentina in the last few years of her life, didn't she? She remarried.
That's right.
Well, and I've spoken to people and said, "Oh yeah, didn't she die of cancer?" Well, not really. No, she died in another unexplained road accident.
There's lots of those, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a lot of bad drivers going along in and around the royal family, aren't there? And funnily enough, the witnesses said that there was this strange flash of light that occurred at just about the time when this accident occurred, which rings bells with a fear too, doesn't it? And outside the tunnel, and she was decapitated. It was now Susan Barantes, believe it or not, is alleged to have had an affair with Prince Philip, going back a long, long time. So there's an interesting one, isn't there?
Right. Okay.
That was spoken about in the British media, by the way, at the time as a possibility.
People have short memories then.
Exactly.
Including myself.
Well, and then you've got what happened afterwards with Sarah and everything, and Susan Barantes. Well, Sarah Ferguson was a friend of Diana. They did apparently have a bit of a falling out.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, they did. Sarah said that she didn't really speak to Diana very much in the last year, but they knew each other. So I'd imagine she's the type who would talk. Mm-hmm. Her mother would have a reason to talk.
Yeah.
Susan Barantes was apparently about to write a book. She'd written a previous book about polo, apparently, which is another royal sort of interest, but who knows what she was going to write about this time. So, again, circumstantial, but when you add these things up...
there's no such thing as a coincidence.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everything points to the fact, and a lot of British people know this, and they still, funnily enough, a lot of people believe that Diana died and was bumped off, and yet can't link up the fact that that maybe we should not be quite so accepting of everything we hear about the royal family.
I think the problem is, because we have all been brainwashed with the oaths. You mentioned that the judge presiding over the inquest would take his oath to the Queen. Yeah. We've got all the military. Yeah. I think bar one division that they make their oaths to the Queen.
Secret Service. They don't serve the country. They serve the Queen, don't they? So if there's something that that they do, it has to be. They're not there to for the general good of Britain. They're there to protect the crown.
The Queen.
The crown.
Yeah, crown.
So
So to draw a line under Princess Diana's death, there has been a lot of media coverage.
Yeah.
And she was very popular, but it's all made life very convenient now for the royal family, hasn't it? Now that time has moved on.
Well, as you say, they say time's a great healer and time's a great forgetter as well, isn't it? I mean, I believe that Diana's link with with the British people was something that the sacrifice, she was sacrificed to break the hearts of the British people.
Yeah.
And it did break our hearts.
Yeah.
Now, yes, there's from a purely human point of view, we can see the relationship between Charles and Camilla. There's no problem about the fact that those two people obviously like and love each other very much. But the way that we've had this year, we've had a royal wedding, have we not?
Yeah.
And everything is presented as though the royal family's moved on. What they've done is they've taken the modernisation, and you can't really modernise an ancient institution like that, but whatever different thinking that there was a result of Diana and her influence, and not the desires of the royal family.
Oh, she broke loads of protocol.
Absolutely. But let's remember that we'll come back to.
Well, the children being taken away and have been filmed with the children going down the water chute.
Yeah,
and of course the Queen used to leave their kids behind, didn't she?
Well, she basically left Charles at the age of 6. That explains why perhaps he was such a, emotionally,
damaged.
I remember when he said, I was thinking about this the other day, that famous quote when that Charles and Diana were engaged and they were talking about love, and Charles says, "Whatever love is," and I'm like everybody else. I'm thinking,
wow. What a statement to make.
I know, but I'm thinking about it in a slightly different way now, because I'm thinking, you know what? That's very, very sad.
It's very telling.
Yeah, because maybe what Charles was saying there was, I don't know what love is at this stage, because I was never loved, because he was the pawn that got left aside when his mother was suddenly, jettisoned into becoming queen. So
let's move. So we're going to move on to Jill Dando, another very famous
very much
death.
So.
And she was murdered
without
on
doubt.
her doorstep.
She was murdered on her
doorstep.
So
what was the significance of Jill Dando? She was a TV presenter.
Yeah.
She was compared with Diana in looks, and
I think that's reasonable as well, don't you?
Yeah.
You can certainly see the resemblance.
Yeah.
Can't you? There's the same sort of inner beauty about her, isn't there?
And a certain quality of innocence as well.
I agree. I totally agree. You just said what was the significance of her as a presenter was. There always seems to be, doesn't there, like somebody on the BBC or somebody on ITV who's like the person of the moment. Sometimes they irritate us slightly because, on this programme, not another programme.
Yes.
Is there, does the BBC only consist of about 5 people and they bring them out,
But she was very popular. But what was she getting involved in at the time of her death?
Right. Well, I think this is significant because, she started off in news. She was actually reading the 6 o'clock news at the time of her death. She'd done things like songs of praise occasionally.
Was she a Christian? Oh,
she was, yeah. We'll definitely talk about that because that's relevant to this as well. She'd done the holiday programme.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that you're talking about there or hinting about is Crime Watch, because I think this is the most significant one. Because obviously reading the news is a serious thing, and but the gravitas that she had, or it was increased certainly by becoming co-presenter of Crime Watch with Nick Ross.
They were a brilliant pair, actually.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I say, if we were looking at the year, in which she passed away, she was seriously at the height of her powers. She's 37 years old. She had she'd gained a lot in confidence, and she was the type of person. It's almost impossible to think that you could dislike her. I mean, the only way you could possibly dislike her at all would be to just out of a green-eyed monster. This woman's got everything.
Really. Yeah.
She was. I mean, it's an underestimated thing to say that somebody was nice, but something that sounds almost like patronising, doesn't it? But she was just genuinely nice.
Nice person.
Yeah.
What was actually happening on the? Was she uncovering a particular case?
Well, that's an interesting thing you're saying that, because one of the I'll throw this one out there.
Wasn't she friends with Cliff Richard?
She was friends with Cliff Richard. Yeah, she was friends with Cliff Richard. There's two sort of possibilities, and who knows? Both of them might be true. We just don't know. As far as the Cliff Richard link is concerned, I mean, you mentioned that Jill Dando was a Christian, and I'm sure, without there's no question, a genuine person who genuinely believed in her faith. Cliff Richard was somebody who she basically admired as both a singer and also a fellow Christian. I'll put that in slightly more in inverted commas. And all we know is that in the last year of her life, a lot of things happened, and one of those things was that Cliff Richard suddenly just appeared in her life. They met at some function and they became friends. Now, doesn't sound too dramatic, really, at the when just seen in isolation.
No.
But you just said, well, what was Crime Watch on at the time? Well, one of the theories is that the Crime Watch may have been investigating a VIP paedophile ring. Now, if we go back to the years that we're talking about, such a possibility such a concept was in the news.
Yeah.
Like the News of the World had stories, about this Elm Guest House in London.
Yeah.
You heard of that? Where MPs, people in high society, musicians, Cliff Richard, used to attend this place, which was described in some early on as a gay brothel, but then became known as a paedophile brothel.
Because these guys were signing in, weren't they? I mean,
yeah,
I've seen the register.
Yeah. You see, some people do forget because like years go by and say, well, there's no evidence for that. But the papers at the time were onto this, and I've seen evidence of the guest book with the people certain people
mentioned.
Yeah, and including Cliff. So it was out there. Now, the BBC. We know, don't we, that the BBC were linked with this. I mean, Jimmy Savile was from the BBC. Some of the other people that have been prosecuted subsequently to the Savile controversy coming out were from the BBC. It's well possible that this was something that Jill Dando knew about, because certain people within the BBC
knew about Jimmy.
Yeah, exactly. And it would certainly be a subject that she would have been aware of. I mean, she didn't make too many comments about Savile, but it was believed that she basically didn't like him. And, like a lot of people took an instant dislike to him, where you could sort of like say it was a gut feeling. I'm not quite sure about that man. I can't quite place it. But that is one possibility. Another possibility, and this was researched by Richard D. Hall, is an independent journalist, is that there could have been a link with the London nail bombing. Now he's gone into this in great detail. There's a guy who's in prison for 50 years called David Copeland, who's believed to have been the person who, he certainly planted.
Take a bomb on board.
He basically planted 3 different bombs in different locations in London.
So nothing to do with planes at all,
No, nothing to do with planes. No, these were sort of on the streets in London. So one was certainly in Soho, strategic areas. Now the reason why he links it with that is that.
And there are nails in the bombs.
Yeah, exactly.
To maim as many people as possible.
Yeah, and there were people killed from the Soho bombing, certainly. The reason that he links it is the timescale, because there were the 3 incidents. The first bombing occurred, and then there was a broadcasting of Crime Watch, which was the last broadcast that Jill Dando ever made. Yeah. And on this broadcast, they mentioned this nail bombing, and they appealed for witnesses, for information.
Yeah.
And there were replies, because Jill Dando read out replies and said that there were interesting views of, there apparently were witnesses to this bomb, people on rooftops watching this happening, which interested Richard D. Hall very greatly, because he believes that the nail bombing was not entirely the work of this one person, but he was being backed by others. He believes that it was an MI5 inspired job.
And people watching this today will be amazed that
such a thing could possibly happen.
Establishment, yes, the Secret Service.
Yeah. Well, what we do know is that nail bombing one occurred, Crime Watch was on television, an appeal went out, there was information. Whether all that information that was gathered was actually broadcast, who knows? It may have been that they revealed a lot more that would, but didn't. You don't expect Crime Watch to say, we've got the name of the person and the person is. They're going to filter that information very carefully, aren't they? But then there were, after that, 2 more bombings, and the death of Jill Dando on her doorstep. So, there's a possibility that maybe those incidents could be linked. One thing I'd draw your attention to is that Nick Ross vehemently denied any link with Crime Watch from day one, and still does to this day, in such a way that you almost say, well, he almost protests too much. Because I think the original story was in the Evening Standard. Yeah. Either on the day of the death or the day after, and it hadn't even been brought up that that there could be any link with Crime Watch at that point. And there he was saying it's ridiculous to suggest that this could be the case. And interviewed in 2016, which is obviously 17 years later. He was saying exactly the same thing, and with the same vehement tones, basically saying that, it's ridiculous to even suggest this. Well, I don't think it is ridiculous to suggest it. No. I mean, the people, first of all, the circumstances of Jill Dando's death are so interesting and so obviously a professional hit.
So was this guy, was it Barry George that got mentioned?
Yeah,
Who was he?
Well, he was the guy who was served more than 7 years in prison for the murder of Jill Dando. He was arrested, I think after about a year actually. It took quite a long while. Now, you just asked who he was, and his link with the Jill Dando murder was very little more than the fact that he lived not very, very far away.
Was he a bit of a recluse?
Yes, he was a bit of a recluse. Now, I remember very, very sort of distinctly piecing together what we were all supposed to believe, which was this, here's a lonely sort of perhaps slightly inadequate guy, on his own. Life's not treating him very well. There's this celebrity who lives nearby. Maybe he had a crush on her. All these things are in. This doesn't mean that any of them are true, but this is what a lot of people thought at the time. Unrequited love. She's not. She's obviously. When there's if there was a stalker situation, you've got that sort of not getting any attention from the person, and he then decides to kill her. Well, oh dear. Unfortunately, the facts don't really
But he faced trial and he was put away.
Yeah, I mean.
Now, what about her fiance? Because we haven't mentioned she was actually engaged when she died.
Yeah, and I think this is really important actually, because if there was one thing that was actually missing from her life for a long time, it was the fact that she didn't have the man. To complete the package, she'd obviously had relationships, but she didn't have the love of her life. Now, she meets this guy, a gynecologist called Alan Farthing.
But he wasn't just any old gynecologist, was he?
Well, he certainly isn't now. That's for certain. We'll certainly come to that. What happened was they were nudged together. He was separating from his wife. friends suggested having a blind date, and they, to all intents and purposes, as far as we know, fall in love, and an engagement party is held, and lots of celebrities are there. Anna Ford was one of them. I'll tell you why I mentioned her in a second. And everyone is very, very delighted. They were due to get married in September of 1999. She did. Unfortunately, she was no longer with us by then. But everything was going well. Now, when I'm talking about the circumstances of the death and why I don't think that Barry George was anything to do with it, what happened was extraordinary in many respects, because Jill Dando, although still living in Fulham, in the road where she met her death, she was spending most of her time, as you possibly would imagine, with her fiancé, who lived a few miles away in Chiswick. So her house was up for sale. She didn't visit it very often. She just went back there for whatever she needed at various times. On the day that she died, very, very few people could possibly have known that she would be there. I mean, she left the place in Chiswick. She went shopping in London, and she comes back to a house, and immediately that she's there and she's got the key in the door. Yeah. This man approaches her, forces her to the ground, and presses a pistol or a gun against her temple, and one shot, she's taken out. It's all done very, very clinically and very suddenly and efficiently.
Which is unusual, would be unusual for somebody who is almost a social outcast, perhaps, and inadequate.
Yeah, and of course, I don't want to say anything about Barry George that sounds sort of patronising or sounds derogatory, because that's he should never have been brought into this in the first place. But yeah, exactly what you just said.
He could be an innocent victim himself.
Yeah, I think he is an innocent victim himself. The thing was that the gun was used in such a way to minimise all noise. It was 14 minutes before anybody found Jill Dando's body, and there she was. She'd been shot in broad daylight in London. So the sort of like witnesses who said they saw somebody walking, down the road, when they saw the person down the road, they didn't think, oh, here's the murderer. They hadn't had a clue that such a thing had happened. Yeah. But they only then say, oh yes, in retrospect, and I'm nothing against them whatsoever. Yeah, there was this man walking down the road. Nobody identified Barry George from that. Only that he might. He could conceivably have been in the area. He was arrested. A lot was made at the time of the fact that there was gun residue on him, but this actually played a big role in his acquittal later on. He'd had one or two appeals that had been rejected, but then science moved on. Yeah, and they were able to ascertain that this gun residue could have been in his pocket for up to a year before this incident. So it's irrelevant almost. There is what we know about Barry George and what we know about the circumstances of that killing do not match, which it feels, and all the circumstances point to the fact that a professional hit was made. And therefore, for whatever reason, there's a state interest in the death of Jill Dando. Now, we'll go back to Anna Ford,
another news presenter at the time.
Yeah, who was there at the engagement. She asked the most extraordinary question of Alan Farthing.
Who's Alan Farthing?
The gynaecologist, the fiancé of Jill Dando. Yes. Right. So she asked this most extraordinary question. The question was, are you concerned? Are you worried that this is a crime that may never be solved? Now, she didn't ask that question like 5 years after the murder. No. She asked it something like, in the first interview that he gave afterwards. Yeah. Well, what sort of question is that? It's so true, isn't it? Because here we are, like 18 is it 19 years later, isn't it?
Wow.
And yes, the crime has never been solved, has it? She was absolutely spot on.
So fast forward to 2012, and Alan Farthing finds himself doing what exactly?
Well, in fact, I think it was yes, it was delivering Kate Middleton's baby. Yeah, and the interesting thing was that when Barry George was finally acquitted, still treated, by the way, as a guilty man in many respects, because he was never offered any compensation, still hasn't been, for the years that he was in prison. But when he was acquitted, there was no call from anyone, notably, you'd expect perhaps the relatives and people, close to Jill Dando, for the case to be reopened. You mean one of the things my view of it is that they are trying to suggest that, oh yes, we know that Barry George really, he did it. The police have mucked things up, but we know it. A bit like the Wimbledon Common. Do you remember the Wimbledon? Yeah, when for a lot of years, everyone think, well, Colin Stagg was never. They made a procedural error, didn't they, in the evidence?
Was it Rachel?
Yeah, Rachel. Yeah, it was Rachel Nickel, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And
so basically,
they made a mistake.
Yeah.
But it was left, wasn't it, saying, well, actually, we all know that he did it, and he didn't. He was. They subsequently found the murderer. Once they started opening their eyes again and opening the case. Well, this is the same situation with Jill Dando. I was about to write a story a few weeks ago saying the silence is deafening, and then we did have a story. So there was a gentleman that came on this morning saying, it was a professional hit, and I know the person who did it, which is an extraordinary statement. But at least it shows some life in the whole thing, because really, from the acquittal of Barry George onwards, it's almost become like something that time has forgotten. Well, we shouldn't forget, because this was a very prominent woman, and she was gunned down on her own doorstep, and someone, some organisation needs to be brought to
justice.
book. Yeah, I mean, it's just extraordinary. There's a silence surrounding it. Again, Richard.
So I mean, these three murders.
Yeah.
It's a bigger picture when you join these cases up.
Yeah.
That it suits the establishment.
Yeah.
If you become too high profile, if you're saying or doing the wrong things, then you become a targeted individual.
Absolutely. I mean, we particularly now. So John Smith got out of the way because a particular agenda to
and
bring
how it changes history.
Yeah. Now then you've got Diana and Jill Dando, who are in their ways are guardians, really. People who were. Diana was certainly putting stuff out there that was uncomfortable for people to hear.
That's right. And
Jill Dando had the power to do the same type of thing.
Yeah.
As a newsreader, as somebody appeared on, who was the darling of television, as a person working on a very, top program at Crime Watch. She had a lot of influence and a lot of power and a lot of sway, and I think that people in high society, people cover each other's and that there was definitely not, and there never has been, a desire for some of the truth about them to come out, and the paedophile ring is one of those. I'm afraid that they know if we can squash it and make sure that this doesn't come out, then it won't come back to us, because they know that whoever's being named, there's higher than them. There's higher than the ones that are named. This is where the whole Savile thing is. People think the story's come out. The story hasn't come out. It honestly hasn't come out, because.
Well, we have a situation where lots of our files evidence files disappear, they get shredded.
Exactly.
I mean, the negligence in the government is astounding, isn't it?
Well, you had the dossier that was handed to Leon Britton, who was certainly one of those who was under suspicion himself. Of course, it happened to be the Home Secretary. Oh, where's that file gone? You know, it was a rather important file, wasn't it? Yeah, these people, they're always covering for each other. So with Savile, what we've forgotten is linking it up with other people. He clearly did not operate alone. He didn't operate a lone crusade to wreck the lives of as many children as he could in this country. He was working with other people.
Well, he had the access to hospitals, to prisons around the country.
Absolutely.
So to tie this up and to give some things for people to think about back home, what should they be doing now? Should they be doing their own research?
That's very important, because you should never sort of like receive things secondhand and take them as being gospel. That's not the way it is. But it's important. It's one of the question marks always against people who are bringing these type of subjects up is, why talk about these dark issues? Let's try to forget them.
You want to bury them, don't
they? But there's a famous quote, isn't there? And that is, it was adapted by someone the other day, which was quite good. And it's on the lines of, we will not have a future unless we deal with the past. And these issues where we have, the state has played a part in silencing people, has played a great deal of influence on where we are now as a country. And we must not make the same mistakes again.
Of course, there's a very famous quote, history is always repeating itself, and we now need to break that. It
does. I mean, where we started with this, and I'll end with this perhaps, is that, John Smith died and a new political party started within the Labour movement. Yeah. There's a real possibility that the same thing could happen again. We are now both the major establishment parties are in crisis. I mean, that's not just because of Brexit. The Brexit gets the sort of like the blame for everything. Yeah. But they're both in a state where the Conservatives have been looking obviously for, an answer to the conundrum of a prime minister who almost threw away the last election single-handed, and the Labour Party is intent on destroying itself from within. Nature abhors a vacuum. There is already talk among circles for a
new centrist
centrist party,
which we understand there have been meetings not so far away from here.
Exactly, you know more about that.
We do.
And are we going to fall for the same trick again, which seems quite believable? We need a change. We need modernising. We need to move forward, but the same characters. And Tony Blair is one of them, because I can't see him being the leader of this party, but he will be in the background somewhere.
Could be somebody like Ruth Davidson.
The likes of Mandelson. They will be there, and we could easily fall for the same thing again.
Well, hopefully now, certainly with these videos, and I know people on social media are beginning to wake up.
Yeah, they are.
To the fact that the establishment aren't, and the judiciary and our parliamentarians are not here for our benefit.
You're right.
Agenda 2021, Agenda 2030. John, it's been a pleasure to have you in the studios today.
Pleasure too. Yeah,
thank you so much for coming. And to the viewers at home, we thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you've learnt some information that perhaps you weren't aware of before you watched the show. And we welcome you to another Stepping Stones to Awareness show very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
And part 2 of this special with John will follow momentarily. If you want to donate to help the Basis Project and Stepping Stones to Awareness, use PayPal. Send to miles@thebasisproject.org via PayPal. Thank you for now.